Hey, I'm Professor Matt, and we're beginning with Chapter 1 from Think with Socrates, an Introduction to Critical Thinking by Paul Herrick. Now, Herrick says right there in the unit intro for Unit 1 that critical thinking in this context doesn't mean negative thinking, doesn't mean you're going to be criticizing people. All it means is to be thinking with a criterion. And in this case, the criterion that we're going to be using means standards tied back to truth. And so rational standards. That's all it's about. Nothing to do with criticizing others, being especially negative yourself. It just means thinking with standards and standards that are tied to rationality and being truth oriented. Now, philosophy, this is a definition that I use and it's very consistent with Herrick's, is the reason-based attempt to answer life's big, non-empirical questions. These questions that philosophers attempt to tackle would include, why is there something rather than nothing? I know that's a very foundational, fundamental question, difficult to answer, but there are some suggested answers out there. Why is it the fact that anything at all exists rather than does the universe have a creator? There's overlap between philosophy and theology, and philosophers have attempted to think through this question using reason rather than faith. That's a contrast between theology or religion and philosophy. In many cases, the questions overlap, but philosophers think them through using reason alone. Another question that overlaps with theology and faith is, do we survive bodily death? What would that constitute? How would it happen? Do we have good reason to believe one way or the other? Socrates himself considered this question and was thinking about it right up until the moments of his actual death, which we'll read about next chapter. What's the most just form of government? Would it be libertarianism, Rawlsian liberalism, Marxist communism, anarcho-syndicalism, some mix, some new theory that's not been brought about yet, adhering to utilitarian standards, strict egalitarianism? Importantly, why? What are the reasons you have why you think that this particular political philosophy, this particular approach to government would be more just, more ethically defendable than another? Is free will an illusion? If we're physical beings and if physical things are subject to the laws of nature and the laws of chemistry and biology and physics, what makes us think that we're actually making free decisions? Why isn't it the case that what we do is simply determined by those chemical interactions and those physical interactions inside our brain? There are some suggested answers to that might be able to defend free will. But those are the sorts of questions that philosophers are grappling with for quite some time. Some contemporary questions that modern day philosophers grapple with include some cool questions. Is artificial intelligence likely to become conscious? If it could, how could we know for sure? If we had good reason to think that it were conscious and that it could feel and it was smart, and it were smart as well, what obligations would we have to it? Would it be okay to treat it simply as a slave? Or would it then possess moral status? Would we have to treat AI differently if we had reason to think it could feel and had a field of vision and a mind? Could artificial wombs be an effective moral solution to abortion? Currently, we have a pro-choice side that wants to maintain or defend a woman's interest in ending a pregnancy when she wants to. And on the other side, we have a pro-life side that would like to protect the value of an unborn developing human and the person which it could grow into and become. And we typically have to prefer one or the other at the expense of the other. The artificial wombs could possibly allow a woman who wants to end a pregnancy to simply transplant it into a fancy incubator, and in which case we could protect both her choice and her interest in ending the pregnancy, but also the value of that young life. So you get both. Could that work? Are there drawbacks? These are questions that modern day philosophers are considering. Other questions related to contemporary technologies would be, is synthetic meat a viable alternative to factory farmed meat? It is something we have an obligation to pursue and consume. Gene editing, what are the moral implications of that? The risks, brain implants. Those are some cool things philosophers are thinking about now. They also think about the classic questions, but these sorts of questions and much more. Now, The book is all about Socrates, and Herrick will argue he was the first critical thinker, but the first recognized philosopher. I suspect there were many people that thought about questions in the same way, they just simply weren't recorded. But the first recorded philosopher was Thales. And what distinguished Thales from others is that he didn't rely on myth or superstition or hearsay to answer these big, difficult, non-empirical questions. Instead, he used unassisted reasoning. He would say, basically, here's my theory, here's the evidence or the argument in favor of it. Let's talk about it. Let's discuss it together and see whether it makes sense or not. If you have a better theory, okay, good. Let's modify this one and let's pursue the truth together in a conversation. This conversation, in many cases, is called a dialectic. And so it's a conversation in which one person would put forward a theory and a rational argument in support of it. We'll talk about what an argument is in just a second. Others would critically examine and discuss it using those standards, those truth-oriented, logical, rational standards. They wouldn't just say, well, I feel like this is better. Instead, they would say there seems to be an inconsistency between this statement and this statement that can't be reconciled. You can't have both of those at the same time. Others would reply and argue for or against it, and eventually it would be revised or rejected on the basis of reasoned discussion. And so it was a collective, collaborative, cooperative endeavor where they would pursue the truth together. Now that's Thales. Socrates, however, is considered the first critical thinker. And the way that Herrick puts it, he says, quote, the first person in history to devote his life to the task of teaching people the art and practice of critical thinking, also the first person to be put to death by a government for encouraging people to think critically, was Socrates. We'll talk about his death enforced by his government here in just a little bit. Now, he was born outside of the gates of Athens. His mother was a midwife, his father a stonecutter. His father may have fought at a famous battle at Marathon, and he may have carved Acropolis statues. And something that I really didn't appreciate or really remember from my own philosophical studies earlier in my philosophy days is that Socrates was a valorized war hero. And the way Herrick puts it, Herrick says, even Spartan soldiers, if you've seen the movie 300, you know about the awesome Spartans. Even Spartan soldiers were often afraid to face Socrates in the brutal, bloody, face-to-face personal combat of the day, where it wasn't just dropping bombs from above. And I'm an Air Force vet, so I'm all about being away from the actual carnage. But he won medals for bravery and refused to accept them and asked instead they be given to others. This isn't something I really appreciated about Socrates, and it allows me to appreciate him and his contributions to Western civilization in a whole new light. I hope that you'll like this cool AI-generated image of Socrates as a hoplite. So he didn't consider himself a teacher. Socrates instead said that he was a midwife of ideas. He helped people deliver their best thoughts. So he wouldn't just tell them, I have all the knowledge, and now I'm going to convey that knowledge to you. Be sure to memorize it and take good notes, and don't quibble or backtalk. No, he said, I'm going to help a person examine what they think. I'm going to contribute a little bit, but primarily I'm going to help them birth their best ideas. That's why he considered himself a midwife in that way. He didn't charge any fees for this. There were people in ancient Greece who charged fees to help people argue better, argue for particular perspectives, and those were called sophists. And they would use whatever techniques would get the job done, rhetorical techniques, persuasive techniques to help a person win their side, win their side of an argument. This is very different from the philosopher's approach. So one way to contrast the philosopher from the sophist would be to think about contemporary modern day philosophy professors versus attorneys. Philosophers at their best are interested in what makes the most sense. They're happy to follow reason wherever it leads. They're not interested in proving a predetermined conclusion. Attorneys, on the other hand, are paid and expected to advocate for a particular perspective. And so they're not so much interested in what's true, they're interested in pushing a particular agenda. And that's not the way philosophers operate. So keep that in mind. That's somewhat rare in our culture for people to be open-minded and interested in what's true rather than simply proving themselves or a particular perspective to be correct. That's the way that philosophers operate. A trick question that professors sometimes will ask you is, how many books did Socrates write? He didn't write any books. However, he had many, many conversations, and 11 of his students with whom he had those conversations wrote books about them, including the great Plato. And oftentimes those conversations took the form of an elenchus. And the elenchus aka the Socratic Method. You may have heard of this. It would happen by Socrates questioning people in the agora, which was simply the marketplace there in ancient Greece or ancient Athens. And he would rationally pursue the truth with them by following wherever reason led, without that predetermined conclusion. Uncovering ignorance along the way, as well as inconsistencies in their beliefs, would allow them to improve their ideas together. Two favorite questions that Socrates asked, this is something that Herrick points out, is number one, what exactly do you mean by that? He would push for precision in terms, precision in definitions. He would force people to say specifically what it is that they meant. And this is important because I often liken philosophers to scientists in our approach to questions. However, scientists enjoy the luxury of testable data, whereas philosophers are grappling with non-empirical questions, things that we can't directly measure. Just consider all the questions that I asked earlier about will AI become conscious? How can we know for sure? How can we know whether we survive bodily death? These aren't things we can go out and point a telescope at and directly answer. But it's very important that we're precise with our terms and with our definitions and with our reasoning, because just like the scientist needs a very precise measuring cup or a very accurate telescope or a precise microscope, philosophers need our reasoning to be especially tight and precise as well, because our main instrument is our thinker. And so those are the concepts that are floating around in there. Be very precise with them. And the most important word in that second question that Socrates would commonly ask is, why do you believe that's true? So it's three little letters, W-H-Y. Why do you believe that's true? What is your evidence? What are your reasons? And he would ask this not to be a jerk, although when you read the dialogues, in some cases, you can think he is a bit of a pest and a nuisance. And this has something to do with the fact that he was forced to drink a poison. He asked too many powerful people, too many awkward questions. But that's the important part of that second question. Why do you believe that's true? So we can examine it and see whether it makes actual sense, whether I should accept it myself. Now, I've talked about and I've mentioned a couple of times the word argument. And it's important to specify what argument means in the philosophical context, because in pop culture, it means people coming together and I believe this, you believe that, and they go back and forth and yeah. Or it's a quarrel between lovers or whatever. In philosophical terms, an argument is very technical. An argument means a series of claims called premises intended to logically support another claim called the conclusion. Remember that. We're talking about an argument, that's it. So an argument can be offered by a single author. And this conclusion thing doesn't mean that it necessarily comes at the end. The person could state the conclusion and then offer the premises in support of it. So don't feel like it's the end of the story. Don't feel like it's a quarrel. Very different. Remember these precise terms. And here's an example from the book, a famous example that's actually used in ancient logic classes. Premise one, all humans are mortal. Premise two, Socrates is human. Therefore, conclusion three, Socrates is mortal. And the way this works is if those premises were true, they would force the conclusion to be true. That's not the case of most arguments. Most arguments are not nearly as straightforwardly put as this one, and they're about more interesting things than whether or not Socrates was mortal. Three attributes of Socrates. He was ugly, he was pious, and he was humble, not necessarily in that order, not necessarily connected. So he was called a frog face. He was said to have had bugged out eyes and receding hairline, short and stumpy. For all his awesomeness, that was one of his attributes, and he was okay with that. He would poke fun at it. He was pious. So even though Socrates was convicted for corrupting the youth, that was part of the charge, convicted for not being as pious as he necessarily should have been, or at least allegedly. He recognized the contemporary gods. As far as we know, he believed in and respected those gods, but he didn't do it as a matter of blind faith. Socrates considered various rational arguments in support of these beliefs and thought they gave him good enough reason to adhere to them. And he was humble. He was humble materialistically and also intellectually. Materialistically, he led a pretty ascetic lifestyle. He didn't seek riches, even though he became famous. And it was said that he would love to go to the agora, the marketplace, and browse the aisles and look at all the very awesome and cool things that he was perfectly happy to live without. So he wasn't necessarily a minimalist, but he didn't care about all this stuff. And he was intellectually humble, And this is somewhat surprising, perhaps, because one of his friends, about when Socrates was around 40 years old, went to see the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle, supposed to be a person who has a direct line connection with the gods at the time, said that Socrates was the wisest man. Um, said, quote, of all men living, Socrates is most wise. And this was the Pythia, aka the oracle of Delphi. And when Socrates' friend came back and told him that the oracle at Delphi, the Pythia, had said that he was the wisest of all living men, he couldn't believe it. So this is ridiculous, whatever. But then he went out and he questioned people and he thought about his previous conversations with people that seemed to be or claimed to be experts in their field, and how, when he got down to the heart of the matter, they really didn't know what they were talking about. He would ask them difficult questions about the nature of justice or the nature of knowledge, and they would start out very prideful and arrogant, but over the course of the conversation, it would be revealed they really didn't know that much. Well, Socrates knew that he didn't know that much. These other people also didn't know that much, but they didn't recognize it until after the conversation. So Socrates concluded that the one advantage he had in all these supposedly knowledgeable, wise men and people in general was that he knew he didn't know anything, whereas they thought they did. And so the way Herrick puts it on page 13, he says, to know nothing about a subject and to be aware of that ignorance, says Socrates, is better than to think one knows it all while actually knowing nothing. Knowledge of one's ignorance is thus itself a form of wisdom. Socrates concluded this is why he must have been considered the wisest man of all in all of Athens. And so he devoted his days to having these deep conversations and to help enlighten others and to further their collaborative understanding of various topics. One of the concepts discussed in the chapter, which was kind of in passing but is important, is the correspondence theory of truth, which Socrates apparently held. And it's a very basic theory of truth. It's important for us to consider in a day and age when people talk about my truth and your truth and relativism. Serious philosophers don't pay any mind to any of that nonsense. Serious philosophers, in most cases, believe the correspondence theory of truth, which is simply that a claim is true or a proposition is true when it corresponds with reality. So a proposition would be there are five fingers on Matt's right hand. And that claim or that proposition is true if and only if I actually have five fingers on my right hand. You might say, well, I believe very vehemently and very proudly and for a very long time that you only have three fingers in your right hand. You can believe that if you want to, but you would just be incorrect. So there's no such thing as my truth. Now, you might define your truth as your perspective, and that's fine. But if we're being serious and technical and precise about what we mean by truth, it's just simply a claim or proposition correspondence with the actual state of affairs or reality. Now, one question is truth intrinsically valuable? Socrates is a value he held, and many philosophers hold, is that knowing what's true is good in and of itself, and being ignorant is bad in and of itself, independent of any further consequences or benefits or harms. And that's something for you to ponder. Is simply knowing what's true, is that itself valuable? Is that itself good, independent of what else might come of it or not? Something for you to ponder. Now, another attribute of Socrates is that by the time he was in his later midlife years, he was famous in all of Athens. So everywhere he went, he would wave at people and they knew, yeah, there's that Socrates guy. And he became the butt of jokes. So in any culture, if you got somebody who's ruffling feathers and they seem to be humble and they're asking a lot of difficult questions, but they're making progress, you might imagine that people would, in some cases, not necessarily revere him, but instead might joke about him somewhat. Herrick includes a passage or an excerpt from a play from ancient Athens called The Clouds. And in The Clouds, Socrates is the butt of many different jokes. I'm going to read just a few lines from that play, which you'll find on pages 30 and 31. So the first actor says, talking about Socrates in a previous conversation, and what did Socrates say about the gnat? Well, he said that the gut of the gnat was narrow, and that in passing through this tiny passage, the air is driven with force towards the breach. And after the slender channel, it encountered the rump, which was distended like a trumpet, and there it resounded sonorously. So the ass of a gnat is a trumpet? Oh, what a splendid observation. Thrice happy, Socrates. It would not be difficult to succeed in a lawsuit, knowing so much about a gnat's ass. Not long ago, a lizard caused him the loss of a sublime thought. In what way, please? One night, when he was studying the course of the moon and its revolutions, and was gazing open-mouthed at the heavens, a lizard crapped upon him from the top of a roof. A lizard crapping on Socrates. That's rich. Now, think about the way he was the butt of these jokes. Think about the way that he approached these difficult questions. Think about the way that he bravely interrogated powerful people as you consider next week's reading from chapter 2 on Socrates' life and death.